Love is in the air, but so is something else, something darker. Valentine's Day is supposed to be about romance, but for some, it became a night of terror they'll never forget. These are true stories of love that turned into nightmares, encounters so chilling, so unexplainable that they make you question just how safe this holiday really is. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the Fear Archives and hit that like button. It helps us keep bringing you the most terrifying true stories. And if you've ever had a Valentine's Day experience that sent shivers down your spine, let us know in the comments. You never know who else might have a story just like yours. Now, dim the lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, if you find an unexpected Valentine's card at your doorstep, don't open it. Every small town has its legends, stories passed down over the years, whispered in dark corners and laughed off in the daylight. But in Millhaven, Valentine's Day carried a legend unlike any other. It wasn't about love, romance, or grand gestures. It was about something far darker. They called it the Valentine's Day Monster, a shadowy figure that appeared on February 14th to take the hearts, literally, of those who were alone. No one knew where the legend began, but the rules were always the same. If you're single, don't be alone on Valentine's night. If you hear drums, it's already too late. Most dismissed it as superstition, the kind of thing teenagers dared each other to challenge. But no one ever did, until Ethan Grayson. Ethan had never believed in ghost stories. A city boy who had just moved to Millhaven for work, he found the town's superstitions amusing. A heart-stealing monster? Come on, he scoffed when his co-worker Sarah warned him. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Every year someone disappears, and when they're found, their chest is empty. Ethan laughed. So what? Some supernatural Cupid is out there ripping hearts out? Please. Sarah shook her head, unamused. Call it whatever you want, Ethan. Just don't spend Valentine's Day alone. Trust me. Ethan didn't trust her, but he did find it odd how every bar, every restaurant, every house seemed packed that night. Families, couples, even groups of friends all huddled together as if scared to be alone. Still, he didn't care. Ethan hated Valentine's Day. His last relationship had ended painfully, and he wasn't about to go out pretending to be in love just to appease some ridiculous urban legend. He was fine alone. That night, as the streets emptied and Millhaven went eerily silent, Ethan sat in his apartment with a six-pack of beer and an old horror movie playing on his laptop. Outside, the town was too quiet. No wind, no cars, no distant chatter. It was as if everything had stopped. Then, at exactly 11:57 p.m., he heard it. Drums. The first beat was faint, like a distant echo. Boom. Ethan sat up. What the hell? Boom, boom. It wasn't coming from the movie. He paused it, listening. The sound wasn't from outside. It was inside. Boom, boom, boom. The walls vibrated slightly like they were breathing. The picture frames rattled, the beer can on the table trembled, and the sound was getting closer. Ethan's stomach twisted. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone's throwing a party nearby. But no, the entire town had shut down for the night. Boom, 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 boom. The noise was now just outside his apartment door. Then came the whispering. Low, incoherent. A chorus of voices speaking in hushed tones as if they were standing just beyond the doorframe. Ethan's throat went dry. He approached the peephole, slow and careful. His breath fogged up the wood as he leaned in. And then, something knocked. Not the way a visitor would, not polite. No, this was slow, heavy, deliberate. Ethan took a step back. Every instinct in his body screamed, "Don't open it." The whispers turned into scraping, something sharp dragging down his door. Then the voice spoke. "You should not be alone." Ethan backed away, grabbing his phone. He dialed 911. The call wouldn't connect. The scraping at the door stopped, and then the handle turned. Ethan sprinted to the kitchen, grabbing the first weapon he could find, a butcher knife. His pulse pounded in his ears. He held his breath. The door creaked open. The apartment lights flickered. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. Then he saw it. A shape stood in the doorway. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human. Its arms were too long, its fingers tipped with glistening curved claws. Its chest was hollow, as if something had been carved out of it long ago. And its face was a shifting void, like a black mass that rippled and churned, refusing to take form. Ethan wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. It stepped forward. "Your heart beats alone," it whispered. Ethan stumbled backward. The shadows in the room stretched toward him, as if they were alive. The drums, oh God, the drums were inside his own head now, pounding, pounding, pounding. Boom, 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 boom. The pain hit him all at once, a sharp, twisting agony in his chest, like something was reaching inside him, wrapping cold fingers around his heart. He dropped to his knees. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the creature kneeling beside him, its empty chest cavity opening like a mouth. And then, darkness. The next morning, police found Ethan's body in his apartment. His door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no weapons. But there was one thing missing: his heart. It had been removed with surgical precision. There was no mess, no struggle. Just an empty chest cavity and the faint scent of something old in the air. There was one final clue. Written on the wall in what looked like deep scratches were 4 words: "Never be alone again." When the news broke, the townspeople didn't panic. They didn't call for an investigation because they already knew. The Valentine's Day monster had claimed another heart, and next year, on February 14th, it would return. Because in Millhaven, being alone on Valentine's Day is a death sentence, and the drums always come for the lonely. There's a house on Oak Ridge Lane that nobody talks about. People drive past it fast, pretending they don't see the boarded-up windows, the sagging roof, the creeping vines that have swallowed the front porch whole. It's been abandoned for decades, but somehow it feels watched. The rumors say someone used to live there, a woman waiting for a Valentine who never came. They say she never left. But legends are just stories, aren't they? That's what I thought too. Until I walked inside. It was February 14th and a storm was rolling in. The wind carried the faintest whisper, almost like a sigh, as I stood at the foot of the crumbling path. The house looked different that day. The "Keep Out" sign that had been nailed to the door for as long as I could remember was gone. The boards covering the windows, removed, and the front door was slightly ajar. I don't know why I stepped forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that something was expecting me. Or maybe it was the red envelope lying on the doorstep. It was old, faded, tattered at the edges, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Inside, in looping cursive handwriting, were 4 words: "Be mine, come inside." I felt a chill run down my spine, but against every screaming instinct in my body, I pushed the door open and stepped into the dark. The house was wrong inside. It wasn't just abandoned. It was preserved, like someone had just left and never returned. A dust-covered table was still set for two. Wilted roses sat in a vase, long dead but still holding their shape, like they had been frozen in time. The air smelled like old perfume, thick and floral, clinging to my skin like invisible hands. And then I heard it, a dull, rhythmic thudding from upstairs. I froze. It wasn't footsteps. It was softer, like the sound of a rocking chair moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. My body screamed at me to leave, but something stronger pulled me forward. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. The wallpaper peeled like dead skin, curling at the edges. As I stepped deeper, the sound grew louder, the slow creak of movement in the room just ahead. I reached the doorway, and the rocking stopped. The room wasn't empty. A single chair rocked slightly, as if someone had just left it. In the dim light, I could make out a vanity dresser, covered in dozens of faded Valentine's Day cards, their ink smeared with time. And in the center of them all, a wedding dress, perfectly preserved, still hanging on a mannequin, its fabric yellowed with age. The air shifted, a whisper of something moving behind me. I turned and saw a figure standing in the mirror. She was wearing the dress. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening. But her face wasn't there. Just empty, hollow skin, like someone had erased every feature she once had. And then she moved. The rocking chair slammed forward, skidding across the floor. The scent of perfume intensified, cloying, suffocating. And then the mirror cracked. Not all at once. Slowly. A single fracture ran across the surface, splitting her faceless reflection in two. Her head tilted again. And then she turned toward me. I ran. I don't remember leaving the room. I don't remember barreling down the hallway, the shadows stretching, the walls groaning as if they were breathing. But I remember the whispers. Not one voice, but many. He never came. He left me here. Be mine. The perfume followed me out the door, into the storm, suffocating me until I collapsed onto the frozen ground. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. I don't know who she was. Maybe just a woman who was left waiting too long. Maybe something older. Something that feeds on the forgotten, on those who were promised love and never received it. But the house on Oak Ridge Lane, it still stands. And every February 14th, people say they see a single light flickering in the upstairs window. A shadowy figure rocking slowly in her chair. And if you get too close, you'll find a red envelope waiting for you on the doorstep. Love is supposed to be the most powerful force in the world. It binds people together, gives them meaning, and fills their lives with warmth. But in Hudson Valley, New York, love didn't bring warmth on Valentine's Day of 2010. It brought something else, something much darker. When police entered the Thompson residence on the morning of February 15th, they didn't just walk into a crime scene. They stepped into a nightmare. To everyone who knew them, Emily and Mark Thompson were the definition of perfection. She was a school teacher, bright and beloved, the kind of woman who left an impact on everyone she met. He was a small business owner, running a local bakery that was a staple in the community. Together, they were the golden couple, the ones everyone looked at and said, they've got it all. But no one really knows what happens behind closed doors. And no one saw what was coming. That Valentine's Day, Emily and Mark planned a quiet evening together. Dinner, a bottle of wine, a night just for the two of them. They never made it to dessert. When Emily didn't show up for work the next morning, her co-workers were concerned. She was never late, never irresponsible. They called her phone, no answer. Then they called Mark's bakery. It was closed. The doors were locked. By noon, the police were knocking at the Thompsons' front door, no response. So they forced their way in. The moment they stepped inside, they knew something was very wrong. The house was too quiet. The kitchen table was set for dinner. Plates, wine glasses, unlit candles. A half-prepared meal sat abandoned on the counter, untouched. The television was on, but the sound was muted, casting eerie shadows that flickered across the walls. Then they walked into the dining room. That's where they found them. Emily and Mark were seated at the table. Their hands were neatly folded on their laps. Their heads tilted slightly, as if staring at one another, engaged in some silent, eternal conversation. Porcelain masks covered their faces. But the most horrifying detail wasn't their stillness. It was what was missing. Both of their chests had been carved open, and where their hearts should have been, there was nothing. Instead, their missing organs sat on the table between them, delicately arranged around a candlelit centerpiece, like some grotesque Valentine's Day offering. The room reeked of blood and love. Investigators quickly realized that there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this, the Thompsons had let them in. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal. Neighbors were questioned. One elderly woman claimed she saw a tall figure dressed in black entering the home around 8:30 p.m. Another heard what she described as a song playing on repeat, coming from inside the house late that night. But when asked to describe the figure, no one could. They had no face, just a dark silhouette moving through the winter cold. It didn't take long for police to find a lead. Emily had been seeing someone. Not an affair, not quite, but something. Dr. Stephen Caldwell, a highly respected surgeon in town, a man with a clean record, the type of person who never raised suspicion, and a man who had been obsessed with Emily for years. Dr. Caldwell and Emily had met at a charity event in 2008. He was captivated by her. The way she spoke, the way she smiled, he wanted her. Emily, polite but distant, never saw him as anything more than an acquaintance. But Dr. Caldwell, he saw something else. He began writing her letters, emails, leaving small gifts at her classroom door. At first, it was subtle. Then, it wasn't. Emily confided in a friend that Caldwell made her uneasy, that he'd started showing up places unexpectedly. At the grocery store, outside the bakery when she picked up pastries before work. But she never told Mark, because she never thought it would come to this. When police searched Dr. Caldwell's house, they found something straight out of a horror movie. A hidden room behind a bookshelf. Inside, a surgical table stained with something dark. Porcelain masks, identical to the ones found on Emily and Mark. And a journal. A twisted love letter filled with obsessions, delusions, and fantasies about Emily. She belongs to me. Mark doesn't deserve her. She will be mine forever. And on the final page, a chilling message. Valentine's Day is the perfect day for love. That was all police needed. Dr. Caldwell was arrested. And when he was confronted with the evidence, he smiled. Dr. Caldwell didn't deny it. He admitted everything. When asked why he had arranged their bodies the way he did, he responded with no remorse. Because now she can love me forever. Dr. Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But even with him locked away, Hudson Valley was never the same. Some say you can still hear music playing from inside their house, even though there's no power. Because in Hudson Valley, Valentine's Day isn't about love anymore. It's about fear, and the ghosts of love stories gone horribly wrong. A Skoda, Michigan was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. A quiet, sleepy community where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other at the grocery store. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where neighbors looked out for each other. But that all changed on February 14th, 1978. That was the night Patricia Spencer vanished. And in the decades that followed, no one would ever find out what really happened to her. Because she didn't just go missing, it was like she had been erased. At 16, Patricia Spencer had dreams bigger than Oscoda. She was restless, always talking about where she'd go, what she'd do, and how she'd leave this town behind someday. She had a rebellious streak, the kind that made adults shake their heads but made her friends admire her. She wasn't a bad kid, not by any means, but she didn't always play by the rules. That's why when she skipped school that afternoon, no one was particularly surprised. What did surprise them was that she never came back. It was early afternoon when Patricia was last seen walking away from Oscoda High School. She wasn't alone. She was with another girl, 17-year-old Pamela Hobley. Neither of them had mentioned skipping school that day. Neither had told anyone where they were going. They were just gone. Later, a classmate swore they had seen them walking down the road, heading away from town. Another witness claimed they saw the girls near a gas station, possibly hitchhiking. They were supposed to go to the school's Valentine's Day dance that night, but neither of them ever showed up. At first, people assumed they had run away. After all, Patricia had always talked about leaving town. Maybe they had finally done it. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the girls never called home, never withdrew money, never surfaced anywhere, people started to realize the truth. They hadn't left. Something had happened to them. By the time the police started looking into the case seriously, weeks had passed. There were no phone calls, no letters, no confirmed sightings. Nothing. The worst part, there were no leads. Authorities scoured the nearby forest, checked local motels, questioned friends, boyfriends, family members, but Patricia and Pamela had vanished like smoke. There were rumors, of course. Some believed they had been picked up by the wrong person while hitchhiking. Others whispered about a party gone wrong, that they had met up with someone dangerous and had been silenced. Some even claimed the girls had fallen victim to a serial killer, their bodies hidden deep in the Michigan woods. But there was no proof, and over time the case grew cold. Years passed. Patricia and Pamela became nothing more than faded photographs on missing persons posters, until 1993, 15 years after their disappearance. That's when a phone call changed everything. A woman, who refused to give her name, called the Oscoda Police Department. Her voice was shaking. She had a story to tell. She claimed that on the night of February 14th, 1978, she had been at a house party on River Road, a few miles outside of town, and Patricia and Pamela had been there too. According to her, the party had been wild. Drugs, alcohol, strangers coming and going. The kind of place where things could get out of control fast. And something had. She swore that the last time she saw the girls, they weren't leaving. They were being dragged down into the basement, and they were screaming. Then, the call ended. The police took the tip seriously. They searched every abandoned property along River Road. They questioned known criminals, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have been involved, but they found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just an empty space where two girls used to be, and so the case went cold again. Over the years, more theories surfaced. Some investigators believed Patricia and Pamela had been kidnapped and trafficked, sold into a nightmare they never escaped. Others believed they had been murdered the very night they disappeared, their remains buried somewhere so remote that no one would ever find them. There was even a theory that they had never left Oscoda at all, that their bodies were still here, buried beneath one of the many empty lots or abandoned houses. But the truth, no one knows. To this day, Patricia Spencer's and Pamela Hobley's fates remain a mystery. Oscoda never forgot them. For decades, locals have avoided walking alone at night. Parents warn their children not to talk to strangers, especially on Valentine's Day. And every February 14th, the town holds a small vigil, a reminder that two girls went out into the world that night and never came back. A reminder that, in some cases, the scariest thing isn't knowing what happened. It's knowing that you may never find out. There's an old saying in Woodmere High, if you leave a Valentine for Miss Langley, you might not make it home. It started as a joke, a silly high school legend, the kind that gets passed down from one class to the next. But every town has a story that feels different, something deeper, something that lingers in the air like a whisper no one wants to hear. In Woodmere, that story belonged to Miss Langley. Back in the late 1960s, Miss Eleanor Langley was one of those teachers students loved. She taught English literature, filling her classroom with the scent of old books and the soft hum of a record player in the background. She wasn't just a teacher. She was the teacher, the kind who remembered your birthday, who believed in her students even when they didn't believe in themselves. And then, one Valentine's Day, she died, right there in room 212, behind her desk. Some say it was a heart attack. Others claim she knew something she wasn't supposed to know, and someone made sure she never told. But the one thing everyone agrees on is that after that day, room 212 was never the same. A year after Miss Langley's death, a student left a Valentine on her old desk. No one knew why. Maybe it was a tribute, maybe a cruel joke. But the next morning, that student never came back to school. His parents claimed he had run away. But kids at Woodmere had their own theory. Miss Langley took him. Every year, someone left a Valentine. And every year, someone went missing. It wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it happened that night, sometimes weeks later. But one way or another, the kids who left a Valentine for Miss Langley were never seen again. By the 1990s, the school had sealed off room 212, turning it into a storage closet. But that didn't stop the legend. Because some people, the reckless ones, the curious ones, they still left Valentines, and they still disappeared. In 2018, 4 students decided to put the legend to the test. They weren't afraid of Miss Langley, they weren't afraid of stories. So on February 14th, at exactly 11:59 p.m., they broke into the school. They picked the lock to room 212, and they left a single red envelope on the dusty old desk. Then, laughing, they ran home, posting about it online like it was just another prank. By morning, one of them was gone. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. Just a single red envelope placed neatly on his bed. It was the same one they had left in room 212. The remaining 3 students, they left town. They never spoke about what happened that night, never even acknowledged it. But one of them, the last to leave, posted something before he disappeared. A single message on an anonymous forum. She doesn't want Valentines anymore. She wants company. The post was deleted minutes later, and the student? He was never seen again. Woodmere High still stands. Room 212 is still locked, but every year on February 14th, someone still leaves a Valentine at the door. No one knows who does it. But what they do know is this. If you walk by room 212 late at night, you can still hear the soft hum of Miss Langley's record player. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear someone whisper your name. The Thames River is quiet at night. Its waters stretch like a black ribbon through the heart of London, reflecting the city lights, swallowing the sounds of the living. But there's a part of the river, just beyond Galleon's reach, where the air is different, thicker, heavier. Some say it's because of what happened on February 14th, 1878, the night when hundreds of people screamed for help, and no one came. The night the SS Princess Alice sank, and the night her passengers never left. In 1878, the SS Princess Alice was one of the most popular pleasure steamers in London. It carried passengers up and down the Thames, offering a gentle escape from the crowded streets. Families, couples, and businessmen alike boarded the vessel, enjoying the cool river breeze, the distant hum of the city, and the illusion of safety. That night, the ship was packed. Over 700 passengers were on board, many of them returning from a day trip to Sheerness. The mood was light, the laughter drifting through the decks, blending with the soft sounds of a small orchestra playing below. For some, it was a romantic evening, a time to celebrate love. For others, it was just another night on the river. But no one, not a single person, could have foreseen the horror that was about to unfold. As the sun disappeared beyond the London skyline, the Princess Alice made her way through Galleon's Reach, a notoriously narrow and treacherous part of the Thames. Unbeknownst to them, another vessel was approaching. A coal ship twice the size of the Princess Alice, named Bywell Castle. It was a monstrous thing, an iron-hulled colossus built for strength, not for grace. The crew aboard Bywell Castle saw the Princess Alice's lanterns flickering in the distance, but there was a miscalculation. The two ships were on a deadly course toward one another. At 7:40 p.m., the unthinkable happened. Bywell Castle struck. The iron bow of the massive coal ship ripped into the wooden body of the Princess Alice, splitting it almost in half. There was no warning, no time to prepare. Passengers were thrown from their seats, their laughter turning to screams as the deck tilted violently. Water rushed in. The ship lurched, taking in more and more of the freezing river. And then, in less than 4 minutes, the SS Princess Alice was gone. Hundreds of people were thrown into the river. Some tried to climb onto floating debris. Others grasped at each other, dragging one another down in their desperation. But the Thames in 1878 was no ordinary river. At the time, London's sewage system emptied directly into the Thames. The water was toxic, a rotting mass of human waste and industrial runoff. Those who weren't pulled under by the wreckage drowned in the filth. Their lungs burned from the stench. Their bodies went into shock before the water even finished the job. The strongest swimmers died the slowest. They paddled in the darkness, calling out names, pleading for someone to pull them from the abyss. But no one came. And one by one, their voices faded into the night. The next morning, London awoke to horror. Bodies littered the Thames, floating face down, tangled in seaweed, washed up on the banks like forgotten driftwood. Some were found locked in an embrace, as if even in death they clung to one another for warmth. For days, the river gave back its dead. Families gathered at the docks, staring at each body as it was pulled ashore, praying they wouldn't recognize the face. But some bodies were never found. Some say they're still there, trapped beneath the surface, reaching for the living. And that's when the ghost stories began. It started with the fishermen. They spoke of whispers on the water, voices calling out names, begging for help. They said the air would turn unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer. Then the riverboat captains reported figures standing on the water, drifting just below the surface, eyes wide, mouths open, frozen in their final screams. At night, along the banks of the Thames, people saw wet footprints appearing out of nowhere, leading from the water, but never going back in. The worst was the cries. Even now, if you stand at Galleon's Reach on a foggy night, you might hear it. the echo of 100 voices crying out all at once. A final scream trapped in time. Many believe the SS Princess Alice never truly left the Thames. Boaters have reported seeing a steamer in the fog, its lanterns still flickering, moving silently across the river. But when they look again, it's gone. Some claim that on February 14th, if you're near Galleon's Reach at exactly 7:40 p.m., you'll see the Princess Alice reappear, playing out her final moments over and over. But be warned, if you hear your name whispered on the water, it means someone is trying to pull you in. The Thames has carried many stories over the centuries, but none quite like the Princess Alice. She went down in 4 minutes. Over 650 lives lost. And some believe that the river has never let them go. So if you ever find yourself near Galleon's Reach on a cold February night, don't look into the water, because something might be looking back. Chicago in the 1920s was a city of two worlds. By day, it bustled with industry, wealth, and opportunity. By night, it belonged to the gangs. It was a time of whispers in alleyways, men in tailored suits carrying Thompson submachine guns, and businesses that thrived under the shadow of organized crime. At the top of it all was Al Capone, feared, respected, untouchable. And on February 14th, 1929, he proved that love had no place in his world. Because on that day, 7 men walked into a garage on 2122 North Clark Street, and none of them walked out alive. By 1929, Chicago wasn't just known for its skyline, it was known for its violence. Bootlegging had made gangsters richer than politicians, but it had also made them ruthless. The police couldn't stop them, and anyone who tried was either paid off or buried. At the heart of it all were 2 rival gangs. The South Side Gang, ruled by Al Capone, who ran the city with an iron fist. The North Side Gang, controlled by George "Bugs" Moran, who refused to bow to Capone's empire. Their feud had lasted years, each side killing the other in a bloody game of power. But Capone didn't play games. When his enemies didn't bend, he broke them. And on Valentine's Day, he planned the ultimate message. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street was a known North Side hangout. Bugs Moran's operation used it as a hub for smuggling Canadian whiskey. Capone's men had a plan. They set up a deal. Told Moran's men there was a shipment of whiskey coming in cheap, the kind of deal you didn't pass up. At 10:30 a.m., 7 men, Moran's top enforcers, gathered in the garage. They were waiting for the shipment. Instead, they got death. A black Cadillac pulled up outside the garage. 4 men stepped out, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in suits. No one inside panicked. It was prohibition. Cops raided places all the time. But when these officers ordered them to line up against the wall, they complied without a fight. Then, without a word, the gunfire erupted. The men were riddled with bullets, submachine guns, shotguns, handguns, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder. By the time the shooters were done, the walls dripped red. The killers? They strolled out, climbed into their car and drove off, just like that. No witnesses, no mercy. And when the real police arrived, the scene was so brutal, some of the officers vomited on the spot. There was only one man still breathing, Frank Gusenberg, one of Moran's toughest enforcers. The police leaned over him, his body soaked in blood, and asked, "Who shot you?" Gusenberg, barely able to speak, looked up and whispered, "Nobody shot me." Then he died. Capone? He was in Florida, sitting in a hotel, laughing. He had an alibi. No one was ever convicted of the massacre. But the message was clear. This was Capone City now. Bugs Moran? He knew he was next. He fled Chicago, his empire crumbling overnight. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was more than a murder. It was a takeover. But some say Capone didn't just claim the city that day, he cursed it. For decades after the massacre, people reported strange things at 2122 North Clark Street. Some said they saw shadowy figures standing in the alleyway, whispering in voices too low to understand. Others claimed they heard the sounds of gunfire, loud, sudden, echoing through the streets, even when no one was there. One local bartender swore that every year on February 14th, a pool of dark liquid would seep through the alley pavement, right where the bodies had fallen. The garage was torn down in the 1960s, replaced with an empty lot. But even then, the ghost stories didn't stop. Dogs refused to walk past the site. People who stood there at night reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if someone was watching. Some even claimed that on cold February nights you could hear men pleading for their lives, followed by the deafening sound of a Tommy gun unloading into the silence. Even Capone himself couldn't escape the massacre. Years later, after he was arrested for tax evasion, Capone sat alone in his prison cell in Alcatraz. But he wasn't really alone. Guards said they heard him talking to someone, pleading, begging. But when they looked inside, Capone was alone. The name he kept whispering, Jimmy. Some believe he was haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the men killed that day, Bugs Moran's brother-in-law. Capone spent his final years tormented, raving about someone in the shadows watching him, waiting for revenge. And when he finally died in 1947, some say he left this world screaming. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was the bloodiest hit in mob history. It changed Chicago forever, and even now, over 90 years later, the site where the garage once stood is still avoided by locals. People say the air is wrong there, too still, too cold. And if you listen closely, especially on Valentine's Day, you might hear it, the sudden pop of a gunshot in the distance, or the whisper of a voice begging for mercy before being swallowed by silence. There's a legend in Hallowell, a village lost to time, hidden beneath endless stretches of frost-bitten fields. It was the kind of place where traditions never died, where superstitions were passed down like heirlooms, whispered between generations. But there was one story that still sent shivers down spines, the tale of the Black Valentine. It began over a century ago. But even now, every February 14th, the villagers still avoid the old chapel on the hill, because those who didn't never came back the same. It was February 13th, 1903, when Eleanor Reed found a strange envelope slipped beneath her window. It was unlike the others she had received that day. The delicate, lacy cards filled with poetry from nervous admirers. Those were ordinary, but this envelope was black, thick parchment, sealed with red wax pressed into the shape of an eye. Inside was a single folded note. The handwriting was flawless, but the ink looked too dark, too fresh, and the words, "To my beloved, my heart is yours forever. Meet me at the chapel at midnight. Let our love transcend time." There was no name, just the feeling of something watching from the ink itself. Eleanor should have been unnerved, but she wasn't. She had grown up hearing the whispers, stories of the Black Valentine, of those who vanished in the night, only to return different. But stories were just that, stories. So that night she wrapped herself in her scarlet shawl, slipped through the snow-covered streets, and made her way toward the chapel. The village was silent, the air heavy with a stillness that pressed against her ears. And in the distance, the chapel doors were open, waiting. The chapel had long been abandoned, forgotten by time, left to rot at the edge of the woods. Its stained glass windows were blackened, its bell tower silent. But inside candles were burning. They lined the pews, melting wax pooling like blood on the stone floor. The air smelled sweet, too sweet, like dying roses left out too long in the sun. And then she saw him. A shadowed figure stood at the altar, unmoving, waiting. His form was tall, but wrong, as if the space around him refused to settle. Eleanor's breath hitched. She wanted to turn, to run, but something held her in place. A force that curled around her ankles, whispering in her bones. And then he spoke. "You came." His voice wasn't human. It was layered, an echo inside itself, stretching far beyond the walls of the chapel. And then the candles went out. The chapel was plunged into darkness, but Eleanor couldn't move. She felt him closer now, a breath against her ear, a hand cold as the grave touching her cheek. And then came the whisper, low and aching. "I have waited so long, my love." She tried to scream, but the world went black. They found her the next morning. She was lying in the snow, her red shawl soaked through with frost, clutching the black envelope in her frozen hands. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't there. It took 3 days before Eleanor finally spoke again. But when she did, her voice was different, hollow, distant, as if something else had crawled inside her skin. She never mentioned the chapel, never said a word about what happened. But every February 14th, she would wake at midnight and whisper to something unseen, "I remember." The villagers tried to forget, but every year after, more black envelopes appeared. And every year, someone was found outside the chapel, staring blankly, clutching the letters with no memory of how they got there. The town eventually abandoned the Valentine's tradition, but it didn't matter, because some promises never break. Some lovers never let go, and every February 14th, if you walk past the chapel at midnight, you might hear a voice call your name, and when you turn, there will be a black envelope at your feet, waiting. Tiana Notice had always believed in love. A bright, ambitious 25-year-old graduate student from Plainville, Connecticut. She had her whole life ahead of her. She dreamed of a future filled with passion, adventure, and the kind of love that felt like home. But love, as she would tragically learn, could also be a weapon. Her relationship with James Carter had started like any other. He had been charming, attentive, almost too attentive. At first, she mistook his constant texts, his possessiveness, for devotion. But over time, his love became suffocating. When she laughed at a text from a classmate, he demanded to know who it was. When she missed his calls, he accused her of hiding something. The man she thought she knew was vanishing, replaced by someone darker. By the time she saw the danger, it was already too late. Tiana ended things with James after a year of dating. She thought she could walk away, that he would move on. But James Carter wasn't the kind of man who let go. The calls started immediately. At first they were pleading. "Tiana, please, just talk to me. I can't live without you." Then they became threatening. "If I can't have you, no one will." The emails followed, hundreds of them. At first they were scattered, desperate, but soon they took on a calculated tone. "I know where you go after work. I know when you get home. You think you're safe? You're not." Tiana went to the police. She filed reports, showed them the emails, the call logs, the voicemails laced with rage. They told her there wasn't much they could do. "Until he actually does something, we can't arrest him." She got a restraining order. It felt like a piece of paper standing between her and a man who had nothing left to lose. Still, she tried to live her life. She went to class, studied late at the library, met friends for coffee. But no matter where she was, she always felt watched. And then, the notes started appearing on her car windshield. At first, they were left at night, under the cover of darkness. But then, broad daylight. He wanted her to know. He was always near. By February 2009, Tiana was exhausted. The police knew. Her professors knew. Even her neighbors knew. She had done everything right. Reported him. Documented everything. But James was always one step ahead. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Tiana received an email from him. The subject line was empty. The body of the email contained only one sentence. "Happy Valentine's Day, my love. Tonight, we'll be together forever." She reported it immediately. The police said they'd look into it, that they'd increase patrols near her building. But there was no urgency in their voices. That night, she pulled into her driveway, clutching her keys tightly. The apartment complex was quiet, still, too still. The air felt heavy, pressing against her lungs as she climbed the stairs to her door. A shadow moved behind her. Her breath caught. She turned, but it was already too late. The first stab was quick, a deep slash across her arm as she raised it instinctively to shield herself. She tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. James. His eyes were wild, filled with something beyond hatred, beyond love, something primal. He dragged her down, forcing her onto the cold pavement, his breath ragged in her ear. "I told you," he whispered. "You're mine." Tiana fought. She kicked, clawed at his face, but he was too strong. The blade plunged again and again. Tears blurred her vision as she felt the warmth of her own blood pooling beneath her. The world was slipping away. And then, footsteps, voices, a neighbor opening a door. James ran. Tiana was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was done. The wounds were too deep. She died within the hour. James Carter was caught 2 days later, hiding in a motel miles away. The police found a bag filled with her letters, photographs, keepsakes from their relationship. In his mind, she had always belonged to him. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. But for those who loved Tiana, the punishment felt hollow, because she had begged for help. She had done everything right, and still, the system had failed her. To this day, Tiana's case is cited in discussions about stalking laws, domestic violence protections, and the failures of restraining orders. Her story is a tragic reminder that love, when twisted by obsession, can turn into something deadly, and that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're the ones who say they love you. Valentine's Day was supposed to be a night of love and celebration. For Claire and Jake, it was their anniversary. 5 years together, 5 years of chocolates, flowers, and candlelit dinners. This year, they had booked a cozy, secluded Airbnb in the woods, hoping to escape the usual crowded restaurants and overpriced meals. But this year, Valentine's Day wasn't about love. It was about fear. Because in the small town of Ridgepoint, there was a legend. Every February 14th, a couple would vanish, their bodies found the next morning, posed together, hands intertwined, with a bloody heart symbol carved into the nearest surface. And the only clue, a figure in a mask, with glowing red eyes in the shape of hearts, seen lurking just before the disappearances. The heart-eyed killer. Claire and Jake had laughed it off when they first heard about it. Now they weren't laughing. The cabin was beautiful, nestled deep in the woods. A warm fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and outside snow blanketed the trees, making everything feel peaceful, still, silent. They had no neighbors, no distractions, just them, alone in the woods. Claire set the dinner table, lighting 2 candles, their flames flickering softly. Jake poured them both a glass of wine, flashing his signature boyish grin. "Here's to 5 years," he said, raising his glass. Claire smiled, but her stomach twisted. Because outside, she thought she saw something move between the trees. A glowing red light. Jake noticed her expression change. "What's wrong?" Claire blinked. Nothing. She must have imagined it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Later that night, as the fire died down, Claire went to wash up. She stood at the sink, letting the warm water run over her hands, steam rising into the air. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired, uneasy. Then, a soft knock, not at the door, at the window. Claire's heart plummeted. The window faced the woods. There was no reason anyone should be out there. Slowly, her eyes moved up and froze. A figure stood outside, just beyond the glass. Tall, motionless, a mask covering its face, and in place of eyes, 2 glowing red hearts. Claire's breath hitched. Then, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness. "Jake?" Claire's voice trembled as she backed away from the window. Silence. Her hand fumbled for her phone, but the moment she turned on the flashlight, something moved outside, a faint crunch of snow. Claire ran to the living room. "Jake!" she gasped. He was by the front door, staring at something in his hands. A Valentine's Day card. It had been slipped under the door. With shaking hands, Jake flipped it open. Inside, written in blood-red ink, "Be mine." The next moment, the front door handle rattled. Jake grabbed Claire's hand. "We're leaving. Now." They grabbed their coats and sprinted to the car, their boots sinking into the deep snow. The cabin lights flickered back on, casting long shadows across the trees. And that's when they saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, still. Watching. Waiting. Jake fumbled with the keys. "Come on, come on!" A heartbeat passed. Another. Click. The car roared to life. Jake slammed it into reverse. Claire's hands shook as she stared out the back window. And that's when she realized. There wasn't one figure. There were several. All of them wearing hard-eyed masks, standing perfectly still, watching, waiting. As Jake floored the gas, the last thing Claire saw was one of them tilting their head, like they were smiling under the mask, like they knew something she didn't. Claire and Jake never returned to Ridgepoint. They told the police, but no one believed them. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign of forced entry, just the Valentine's Day card still sitting in the evidence locker. And the legend of the hard-eyed killer, it never stopped. Because the following year, another couple vanished. A bloody heart was carved into their cabin wall, and the only clue? A lone Valentine's card resting on the doorstep. It read, "See you next year." Some legends are just stories. Others are waiting for their next victim. Would you spend Valentine's Day in Ridgepoint? Let us know in the comments. And if you ever find a mysterious card at your door, don't open it.